In 2016, Islands of Adventure welcomed its newest ride, Skull Island: Reign of Kong. Universal was attempting to take a portion of their Hollywood tram tour and turn it into a standalone attraction at the Orlando resort. This formula wasn't new. It was actually the foundation of all the rides at Universal Studios Florida's opening day. But by 2016, it had been over 2 decades since this formula was used, and Universal had changed drastically in that time. The question on everyone's minds when Skull Island: Reign of Kong opened was, how could Universal elevate the tram tour experience to stand on its own? This ride not only had to exceed what the tram tour offered, but it also had to live up to the history and importance of the Kong brand that fundamentally shaped both Universal Studios Hollywood and Universal Studios Florida's earliest days. And it also had to anchor the only mini-land in all of Islands of Adventure. So did Skull Island elevate the tram tour stop and live up to the legacy of King Kong? Or does Universal regret the decisions that led to the ride? In the early 1980s, public interest in King Kong had just been reignited. This was largely due to the 1976 remake of the original film and the legal controversies and challenges that surrounded it. Universal wanted to capitalize on this popularity and see if they could bring a more traditional attraction-style experience to their studio tram tour. Ever since the introduction of the Flash Flood to the tour in 1968, there was an effort by Universal to make their tour a more consistent and repeatable experience that wasn't entirely reliant on live productions. Throughout the 70s, Universal added the collapsing bridge, Jaws, and the rock slide, which would be removed before the decade was through. But with Kong, the opportunity was clear to do something bigger. Universal saw what Disney had been doing in Anaheim and contracted former Imagineer Peter Alexander to spearhead the creation of a tour attraction at a scale that could rival even the best Disney rides of the time. Alexander, working alongside another former Imagineer Bob Gurr and countless other industry veterans, worked to create a King Kong figure that was 30 feet tall and build a show around the tram being caught in the midst of Kong's rampage through New York City.
Universal Studios tour, and this time, he wins.
When construction was completed on this new attraction in 1986, Universal executives knew that they had something special even before guests experienced it. The experience wasn't just a demonstration of practical effects like Universal had done previously. It truly felt like guests were driving into the middle of the actual movie. This started by building anticipation as the tram entered the show building to the streets of New York decimated in the wake of Kong. Guests heard news coverage of the event and saw Kong only through police search helicopter shadows. The intensity ramped up as Kong in the shadows takes down a newscopter that plummets down to the left of the tram in a blaze of fire. The tram moves forward to try to escape the chaos, but as it makes the turn, the 30-foot-tall Kong animatronic reveals itself to the right of guests. As the police try to help the tourists and stop Kong, it backfires, and Kong tries to attack the tram, violently shaking the bridge and roaring ferociously just a few feet away from guests. Kong's signature banana breath emanated from the beast just as the tram manages to escape the bridge and exit the soundstage. The experience packed the theming and storytelling of the best Disney rides into just 2 minutes while not feeling so out of place in the middle of the production tour. The story and thrills that Kong provided were a game changer for not just the tour, but also how Universal viewed their attractions. Kong was their first real step into what we would now call themed entertainment, and with its success, it fundamentally changed the direction for the company. Kong is directly cited as the reason that Universal had the confidence to move forward with their plans for a studio theme park hybrid in Orlando. So it was only natural that Kong would be a major part of those plans.
The year 1990 was truly a milestone for Universal. The great Hollywood studio celebrated its 75th anniversary. And 21 years after its conception by Jay Stein, chairman of the board of the MCA Recreation Services Group, Universal Studios opened its gates here in Orlando.
As the plans for the Orlando park evolved in the wake of Disney MGM Studios, the King Kong encounter served as the blueprint for the rides that would make up Universal Studios Florida on opening day. The Ride the Movies concept was born out of the experience Kong brought to guests on the tram tour, where guests forgot they were on a ride and felt like they were face to face with the main character of a classic movie. What the evolved plans for Florida allowed, though, was longer storytelling and bespoke ride systems to even further immerse guests into these movies. King Kong was one of the clear headliners for the up-and-coming park, and the design team wasted no opportunities to reinvent and expand upon what the studio tour had originated. The first step in upping the immersion was replacing the tour trams with a more thematic and capable ride vehicle. Universal opted to take inspiration from the Roosevelt Island Tramway to create a suspended dark ride capable of rudimentary motion simulation. Universal also upped the scale of the ride by constructing one of the largest show buildings ever created that was capable of housing not just one, but two King Kong animatronics, even bigger than the one in Hollywood. These figures are still some of the most impressive animatronics ever created, especially considering their time. The ride would be able to take longer in its storytelling with all this extra space, with a ride time of over double the tram tour experience. The ride started with guests boarding the aerial tramways as their last escape route that Kong hasn't destroyed yet. News coverage is heard as their live tram operator tries their best to keep you safe. Kong starts his destruction out of view of guests, just like in Hollywood, with various practical effects selling the carnage, such as water geysers, sparks, and a lot of fire. As the cable car continues on, Kong appears at a massive scale hanging off a bridge to the left of guests. A police helicopter is heard nearby and tries to save guests by opening fire on Kong.
Don't shoot! I repeat, do not shoot! What are you doing? What you want?
This only angers the ape, and he swipes at guests, causing the ride vehicle to drop and the helicopter to go crashing into the bridge. As they slowly make their way past the angry Kong, guests think that they're in the clear as Roosevelt Island Station is just ahead. But as they round the corner, they are blinded by the searchlight of another chopper. When the light goes out, Kong is back, and this time even closer to guests. He grabs hold of the tram, which shakes and drops as guests are so close to the beast they can smell his banana breath. The tram narrowly escapes as the authorities try to defeat Kong again. As they're pulling into the station, guests are shown footage of them on the ride, spliced into news clips covering the confrontation. Kongfrontation was one of the most ambitious rides ever created, and with that came a lot of issues early on. However, once the ride settled in, it was clearly the gem of Universal's catalog. While Jaws was exciting once they finally got it working, Kong rivaled the best technology the industry had ever created. The animatronic figures would be impressive even if unveiled today. Universal had successfully taken what made the original tram tour experience and brought it to a different level that wowed guests even more. So much so that Universal began adding more traditional rides to their Hollywood lot, creating the park that we now know. Before we continue diving into King Kong's history at Universal, I want to thank this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. If you've watched some of my older videos, you may know that I actually used HelloFresh right after I graduated college, and it helped me feel so much more comfortable cooking my own healthy meals. Their pre-portioned meal kits are always fresh and come right to your door. Their menu also keeps growing, and sometimes it makes it difficult to pick just a few things. Their new recipes have larger portions and premium proteins like steak that don't cost extra. But really the best part of HelloFresh to me is the convenience. The past few months have been crazy for me, traveling to some parks outside of Orlando, but knowing that I have easy-to-make meals waiting for me at home has kept me eating healthy. And for the days when I don't even have 20 minutes to make a meal, HelloFresh now has options that are ready to eat in just 3 minutes. As a bonus, if you use my promo code BMODEHFZWL, you'll get a free Zwilling 4-star chef's knife on your third box, which is a $145 value. You'll also get 10 free meals and free shipping on your first box. So make sure to use my code to get these deals before supplies run out. Thank you again, HelloFresh, for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Just as Universal Studios Florida opened, Universal had some contractors looking at the possibility of creating a ride based off the novel Jurassic Park, which Steven Spielberg had just acquired the film rights for. This ride was planned for Universal Studios Florida and had promise, but would be contingent on if the movie adaptation was a success. When it was released in 1993, it was a hit and is regarded as a classic to this day. But when it came to greenlighting the ride, Universal had actually changed their mind and worked it into their recently announced second Orlando park, which would become Islands of Adventure. An unexpected benefit of the team designing the ride before the movie even entered development is that it takes a lot of inspiration from the scenes only found in the novel and not the film. This let it work into the literature theme of Islands of Adventure while still capitalizing on the huge success of the film to draw guests to the new park. Jurassic Park was clearly the major brand that Universal was using to market and showcase the new park, and because of this, they wanted to give it space to grow. 2 expansion pads were left on both sides of Jurassic Park. These were the only major undeveloped spaces in the park on opening day, so both would need to be used wisely in the coming decades. Universal would shock a lot of people in 2002 by announcing the closure of Confrontation after just 12 years of operation. This would start the domino effect of Universal scrapping all but one of their opening day attractions for the sake of constantly having something new to offer. While Progress was the reason Universal cited publicly for the closure of Confrontation, it probably didn't hurt that Kong was also incredibly expensive to operate, even with its great capacity. The ride had a massive amount of team members required to operate it on a daily basis, and the maintenance on the 2 gigantic Kong animatronics could not have been cheap after a decade. The last rides on the aerial trams would take place on September 8, 2002, and the next day, the only way to encounter Kong would once again be a stop on the Hollywood Tram Tour.
Hours after it began, a massive fire at Universal Studios in California was still raging. Flames tore through movie sets and parts of the theme park early Sunday morning.
The fire started in the backlot area, the facades.
Among the losses, movie sets, mock-ups of New York and New England streets, a King Kong exhibit, and a video vault building that had more than 40,000 videos and reels.
That would be the case until a fire would ravage the Universal backlot, destroying the original King Kong encounter. Universal didn't have any intention to rebuild the encounter as it was. Instead, they saw this as a perfect opportunity to modernize the experience, not just from a ride standpoint, but from a King Kong standpoint. Now, Universal didn't make the 1976 remake of King Kong, but they did make the 2005 version. They started working on a modern Kong experience from the tram tour shortly after the fire, and it would be ready for its debut just 2 years later. The new experience would be entirely digital, taking advantage of 2 massive warped 3D projection screens on both sides of the tram. This, alongside a motion base, wind, water, and scent, would immerse guests into the experience. This time, instead of being brought into New York City, guests would be brought earlier in the film to join Kong on Skull Island, as he saves guests from being attacked by T-Rexes. While the technology of the experience was impressive at the time, it didn't match the ambition and storytelling that the original Kong encounter had. But on a tram tour, this wasn't as much of an issue. While an important part of the entire experience, by this point, Kong wasn't the only show scene on the tour, and the rest of the park expanding into more traditional rides de-emphasized the need for another risky, massive Kong animatronic. So while reception was mixed, it was nice to have such an important figure like Kong back on the tour, but he was still absent in Orlando. After Kong 360's opening in Hollywood, Universal saw the potential to repeat history and bring back the fan-favorite Kong to Orlando. This time, instead of Universal Studios Florida, they looked towards the Jurassic Park expansion pads at Islands of Adventure. In the years since, one of the 2 pads was used to create Hogwarts and Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey for the Wizarding World retheme and expansion of Merlinwood. This was clearly a great choice for the expansion of the park and has contributed greatly to the long-term success of Universal as a whole. The other expansion pad did see concept art for a Jurassic Park Jeep attraction, and certainly others as the years went on. But in 2014, Universal pulled the trigger on using that space to bring back King Kong.
News for fans of Universal Orlando nostalgia. After months of speculation and buzz, Universal has finally announced that King Kong's rampage is far from over. West 2's Amanda Ober is on Theme Park Patrol.
He's back. like it's been 13 years since the original King Kong attraction at Universal Orlando closed, but next summer inside Islands of Adventure, the Big Ape returns with a ride called Skull Island, the Reign of King Kong. In the original movie, Kong crosses the ocean to terrorize New York City, but Universal says its ride is a whole new story.
This character is so iconic, and we're really coming up with the next generation of storytelling for such a legendary character like King Kong, and I think that's what's important.
Instead of New York, the King Kong adventure will be set on his homeland of Skull Island. Guests will traverse a jungle, encounter hostile natives, and board large expedition trucks to travel the island, where of course they'll encounter its ruler, King Kong. It looks frightening, but creators say it is for all ages.
This is really going to be appropriate for the entire family. I mean, we have some tense moments, but it's just overall, it's going to be a great, thrilling attraction. We do have a height limitation of 34 inches, but it's really meant for everybody in the family.
This was going to be the first time since the opening days of the Orlando resort that Universal was going to take a tram tour experience and turn it into a standalone ride. This was their opportunity to show how they've progressed in the industry, and there were expectations for this ride far beyond Kong 360 in Hollywood. In 2016, the ride would open, and guests would approach the ride in its own mini-land, confusingly also called Skull Island Reign of Kong. Just like in Hollywood, this land would take guests to Kong's home on Skull Island instead of bringing him to New York City. Dominating the background of this area is a large, ominous temple, enticing guests to walk through the ape-shaped entrance to the ride. The queue of the ride begins outside, where it's set up that guests are joining the Eighth Wonder Expedition Company on Skull Island to research the creatures that inhabit it. To make their way to the base camp, guests wander through a different temple than the one seen outside. The temple is littered with human skulls, setting this eerie tone. Through some peepholes in the walls, guests may catch glimpses of Skull Island natives depicted on screens. Continuing on, guests enter a large room where a shamaness animatronic warns them of their impending danger through ritual. Her ritual triggers other effects and even a blackout in the room. Guests continue on through a narrow passage towards the base camp, but as they continue, more and more skeletons are present. Just after one of the skeletons, a live scare actor might jump out at guests, just as one would expect from a Halloween Horror Nights house. You eventually make it to the base camp with crates and equipment scattered around. An animatronic Carnictus in a cage snarls at guests as they filter into the loading area and pick up their 3D glasses. Guests are then ushered onto large expedition trucks that look like if one section of the Hollywood trams were isolated and themed. The vehicle utilizes a trackless ride system to move out of the station and into the outdoors. As guests are acquainted with their specific driver, they make their way into the large temple.
You ever get the feeling you was being watched?
Once inside, guests spot the bones of a giant ape as large bats are angered by the truck's presence. On a screen, Kate and Joe from the Expedition Company are getting things set up when these large bats swarm and capture Kate, and the mission to rescue her is on.
Hang on, Kate, we're coming!
The truck moves on to another screen, this time in a muddy swamp, where Kate escapes the bat, only to be surrounded by beetles, scorpions, and carnicti. Kate battles these creatures, spraying guests in the process, but just as it seems the coast is clear, she finds herself trapped inside a giant scorpion claw and pulled into a burrow. The truck continues into a large 360-degree screen and rests on a motion face. The truck tries to make its way back to base camp, but is instead caught in the middle of a pack of V-Rexes, and a very familiar scene plays out. While slight adaptations were made for the ride, at a fundamental level, this scene is Kong 360 3D from Hollywood. Guests watch as Kong and a V-Rex battle it out, with Kong trying to protect the guests and ultimately saving them in the end. The truck moves forward and informs them of their encounter with Kong when the ape himself appears in animatronic form beside guests. The figure takes in the truck and the guests on board with a subtlety in his eyes. He roars, but not in anger, more in a sense of triumph, and the truck drives back to the base camp.
Yeehaw! Wait, buddy!
Kate radios back to the truck, letting them know that she's okay, and the driver relays the unforgettable encounter they just had. The ride was quickly polarizing. For a lot of people, having any Kong representation back at Universal was welcome, especially in the wake of more and more classic Universal IPs being removed from the parks. The facade was incredibly well executed and did an excellent job at drawing guests in. The queue was also super well received with its unique world building and grim tones. The multiple animatronics, the subtle use of screens, and the live scare actor all were well above the standard at the time and felt like a clear evolution of theme park cues. But what garnered the most praise in the early response to the ride was the animatronic Kong. In an era where Universal was known for screens, the Kong figure stood out. While not at the scale of what was found in Kongfrontation, this version had far more articulation in its face, allowing for very subtle and nuanced motions, which the ride team would utilize. The animatronic was quickly hailed as one of the best ever created, and that helped make the ride a must-do for many guests in its early years. But now, a decade later, I think this polarized view of the ride has started turning more and more negative, and not even the animatronic can distract from it. While the ride wasn't necessarily bad when it opened, it hasn't aged as well as I think Universal would have hoped. For starters, it never really fit into Islands of Adventure as a whole. Islands of Adventure's literary theme was still present as ever when Kong was added, and while Kong has had novelizations, his story starts on the silver screen. His lack of ties to the central theme of the park only exacerbate the issue that this land really isn't a land. It was clearly meant to be a part of Jurassic Park. So much so that we lost one of the arches for that land so that Skull Island and it could blend into one another and not be a defined line. Skull Island really only encompasses the ride and a snack stand, and unlike everything else in the park, it's landlocked. Turn around and you'll see Camp Jurassic and glimpses of Velocicoaster. I'd wager a lot of casual tourists don't really know where Kong ends and where Jurassic begins. And while that may work for a lot of parks, it doesn't work for islands. Every other land in this park is fully fleshed out with not just attractions, but also places to just explore like Camp Jurassic and Me Ship the Olive. So to use that last remaining expansion spot for something that goes against the grain for the rest of the park meant it needed to be something so good that people were willing to overlook that. Unfortunately, the ride isn't consistent in quality, and so much of this goes back to the decision to try and reuse the simulator tunnel that they did in Hollywood. This forced Universal to create a ride system that essentially mimicked the tram itself. This led to a wide-body truck that couldn't go very fast and relied on motion simulation to sell thrills. This is in contrast to how Kongfrontation took full advantage of the freedom of ride system and created something that wouldn't be possible in Hollywood. While their ability to make a trackless ride vehicle that can maneuver both inside and outside is impressive, the limitations are just so apparent and hold the ride back. The viewing angles are bad for most guests because of how wide the rows are. This is especially bad with the Kong animatronic, as the guests on the left don't get the intended experience as they watch from a distance. The original tram tour experience understood this and had the helicopter crash on one side and Kong on the other, and Kongfrontation solved this with each side of the tram getting a Kong encounter. I know it's a minor detail, but things like that matter when it comes to perfecting rides. Another complexity that comes from the ride system is that outdoor section. While it's great when it works, it puts a lot of wear and tear on the ride vehicles, and that's led to long stretches with it out of operation. And when that happens, the story just jumps from one temple to another with no transition. This was also the case with the removal of the 3D from the ride in early 2024, weakening the experience further. And to complete the rule of threes, the live scare actor in the queue went away in 2020 and has never returned. But the nail in the coffin for these ride systems came earlier in 2018 with the opening of Fast and Furious Supercharged. This ride was an even worse adaptation of a tram tour experience and soured the masses on these bus-style rides. This was the final straw for the oversaturation of screens at Universal and would shift them back towards practical attractions in the years following. This Universal Parks renaissance happening so shortly after Skull Island only made its shortcomings more obvious. Hagrid's and Velocicoaster being the next two rides following it blew it out of the water and relied on true thrills in real sets. For me though, the biggest issue is that the ride's story throughout the entire experience doesn't work, but not in one clear and obvious way. This starts with the tone the experience takes. The facade and queue are distinctly setting up a horror-based attraction, down to having creatives who work primarily on HHN help with the queue's design. It pulled off this just horror enough energy well, but the ride's tone is far less horror and far more adventurous. While you can make a horror ride with this brand, the ride system and the repurposing the Hollywood assets made this not possible, creating this disconnect. Also stemming from the repurposing of the Hollywood tunnel section, the story on the ride itself just doesn't hold weight. The tunnel segment is a glorified demonstration of the motion simulation and projection technology of the time, with very little story happening. So what happens in Orlando is that you get introduced to your driver, Kate and Joe, and you settle into a rhythm where in the first 2 scenes your job is saving them, and just at the last minute, Kate gets pulled into more and more danger. But then when you enter the main tunnel, Kate is nowhere to be seen or heard, and Joe gets very subtly taken out in the midst of the Kong vs. V-Rex battle. The only conclusion to that storyline is hearing Kate's voice confirming that she's okay as you're pulling into the unload station. The main characters you're set up to care about disappear just as the ride is getting going. But maybe its biggest cardinal sin is that the story it tells and the ride it is just isn't what guests expect and want when they hear about a King Kong ride at Islands of Adventure. While Kongfrontation set the bar so incredibly high, there was still a way to create a modern Kong experience that guests expected. The twist of visiting Kong on Skull Island instead of after his capture and transport to New York, while good intentioned, meant that we weren't seeing the Kong that has permeated pop culture. The horror and fear set up by the queue is not paid off even though the brand could allow it. Kong isn't the antagonist of this ride. He doesn't drive the conflict, and he's our protector. While in the films this does make sense for where he is, the average person doesn't remember that. They remember the angry ape terrorizing New York City, and that's it. This leads people to be let down by the Kong encounter at the end of the ride, not feeling this grand sense of terror. The ride builds up to a letdown for the average tourist, and I just don't think that's what Universal intended. I think Universal wishes they had a second chance at bringing a modern King Kong ride to Orlando. While at the time the decisions made around Skull Island may have made sense, they quickly became decisions I think they regret. There are really strong pieces to Skull Island. The queue, especially in its original form, was not only immersive and set up the story the best it could, it also brought new ideas and concepts to the table that people still talk about to this day. The temple and marquee for the ride are some of the most beautifully executed in Universal's history and do an incredible job pulling in guests. And the animatronic Kong is still a feat of engineering that delivers a wow moment, even if it's not the wow moment that guests wanted or expected. But so many pieces of Skull Island hold it back from being the e-ticket that Universal promised and living up to the legacy of King Kong. While Kongfrontation learned from and elevated the original tram tour experience to the next level, Skull Island didn't go far enough to differentiate itself from Kong 360. This impacted the story, the ride experience, and its legacy. The tram ride system, when utilized outside of Hollywood, is clearly flawed and can't deliver an e-ticket experience in the modern age. Universal knew this in the 90s, and yet tried to make it work again in the 2010s. Even with the proper budget and time put into a more coherent and practical story playing out around the ride vehicles, its limitations would still hold it back to being at best a C-ticket. Pair this with the decision to not feature the Kong that pop culture remembers, and instead have him be the hero of the story, and what you get is a ride that's confusing and can't live up to the expectations that were set in previous attractions. King Kong isn't just any old IP for Universal, it's what in a lot of ways started everything for them in the theme park space. Whether or not they like it now, that legacy gives way to heightened expectations and can't be wasted on a mid-tier ride. I'm not saying the ride itself isn't enjoyable. It's fine, and it's a good filler ride on a park day. But it wastes one of the most important brands that Universal has the rights to. I think had the discussions for a new King Kong ride in Orlando began even just a few years later, we could have ended up with a groundbreaking attraction that truly felt like the successor to Kongfrontation. Imagine a Kong ride, but built with the same design philosophy as rides like Velocicoaster, Monsters, and Ministry. The opportunities could have been endless, but instead we're left with a forgettable ride. Unlike Fast and Furious Supercharged, Skull Island Reign of Kong isn't bad enough to warrant being closed and replaced so soon after its construction. But it's also not good enough to move the needle, and because of that, one of the pillars of Universal will be underutilized in the theme park space for years to come. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Remember to use my promo code BMODE HFZWL at the link in the description to let them know that I sent you, and also help support the channel. Otherwise, thank you again for watching and for your support, and I'll see you in the next video.
And if this tour doesn't work out, they're going to turn him into a condo.